Okay, well, welcome everybody to Solar Noon Tuesday. And as per usual, we'll go ahead and start with the news of the week. So the news this week starts out with a study from Berkeley Labs. And the study found that those residents that are located near to a large utility scale solar farm, the property values are adversely affected, at least according to this study. They did find that about, on average, about 1.5% decline in the property values. It's not quite so simple as that, though. The study looked at 6 states. It looked at California, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Minnesota, New Jersey, and North Carolina. And those 6 states, they're in combination, make up about 50% of all of the utility scale solar arrays that are installed in the country. When they looked at if you're located within half a mile of one of these versus 4 miles away, so that's how they determined, property values, those located half a mile versus 4 miles away. They did find that in Minnesota, the property values declined about 4%. In North Carolina, they declined about 5.6%, and in New Jersey, declined about 5.8%. But they found that there was really no adverse impact in California, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. So the decline in value was not universal. A lot of it also depended on what was on that property before it was developed as a solar array. So if it were agricultural or very low density residential, then yes, it did impact the value of nearby property. But if it was industrial, if it was a brownfield, if it was more urban in nature, then it had no impact at all. And that kind of makes sense, because obviously if you're living near a power plant and they convert it to solar, it's not going to affect your system or the value of your property. Might actually improve it. There was another study from a group, S&P Global Market Research, and they found that last year we saw a lot of large-scale solar storage systems installed in the US. In fact, 4.2 gigawatts of storage in 2022 versus 2021. That was an increase of about 29% year on year. But what the study really showed is that the boom in batteries, battery installation is really just beginning. It's sort of the tip of the iceberg. In fact, in 2022, even with that tremendous growth, about 54% or 58%, sorry, of the planned installs in 2022 were not installed because of supply chain constraints. So they were only able to install about 42% of all of those that were on the books. And they're projecting over the next 5 years that we'll see about 62 gigawatts of battery storage, large-scale storage installed into the grid. 62 versus 4 last year, which was a record number. Corporate renewable energy contracts, again, last year saw a huge increase, 45% over the year before. This, again, with a study from S&P Global Market Research. High tech really led the way of corporations that were installing solar and wind. As far as these contracts, Amazon installed about 15 gigawatts of solar, or bought contracts for that much, followed by Meta, which is Facebook's parent company, Google, rounding out the top 5, Microsoft and Verizon. When you look at market segments, the high-tech segments like Google and Meta, those led the way with these kind of contracts. Second was all of the telecommunications companies, Verizon, cellular, whatever they are, but there's huge, all of the mobile phone companies. And then third was manufacturing. The U.S. Department of Treasury did some clarification on some of the rules that are going to be applying to the Inflation Reduction Act. You remember, of course, last year, the Inflation Reduction Act put in place quite a number of incentives for renewable energy. For example, there was the 30% tax credit that everybody qualifies for, but then they also had 10% if it was domestically produced product, another 10% tax credit if you installed it in a low income area, another 10% if you put it into a traditional fossil fuel or at where an existing power plant had been. So now they have to define what that means. Well, they came out with what low income, how they're going to administer that program. They did cap the amount of low income that qualifies at 1.8 gigawatts of installed solar per year. About 20% of the projects have to be 5 megawatts or smaller. So they're trying to focus on the smaller projects, and they will give priority to low-income housing. So residential or apartment buildings for low income will get first priority. If they don't use all the funds that are available in a given year, it'll roll over into the next year. So this is a limited thing. It's not a guaranteed tax credit like for instance, the 30% tax credit. Some data from EIA, which is the Energy Information Administration at the US government, showed that in 2022, renewable energy generation in the US grew at about 12.5%, and that solar specifically grew at about 24% year on year. And now renewable generation accounts for about 23% of all of the energy that's on the grid. We get these numbers, and there's a difference between capacity, like the nameplate capacity of a generating facility, and how much of the power that's used was actually generated through that capacity. If you have a base load system like a nuclear power plant that's always on, even though its nameplate may be one thing, it's going to contribute more power to the grid than, say, a wind turbine that gets turned on and off. So that's why these numbers vary slightly. There was another study from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and they found that in 2021, about 90% of all of the new generation on the grid came from renewables. Of that, about 56% was solar, about 44% was wind, and about 10% natural gas. And that's kind of right in line with what we're looking at projections from the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, that's saying over the next 3 or 4 years, they're really seeing that natural gas is only going to account for about 10% of all of the new generation, and that renewables is going to stay at about 90% as we move forward. And that's pretty much the news from the solar industry for this week. Does anybody have any comments or anything they want to add to that? Give you just a second. I guess I'm the only one reading the papers, right? So, all right, well, let me jump in. The item that I thought we would discuss a little bit today, because it came up in some conversations that I was having, was about the ratings for solar panels. And it can be a little bit confusing, so I thought I'd just take a minute to discuss that. And also, again, let people know that if you've got something else you want to bring up for discussion, something you've run into this week that maybe you can get some feedback on, that's part of the reason for these sessions as well, is to let people talk with each other and try and help them out. So when we look at making sense of the panel ratings, let me just sort of recap what kind of ratings are we talking about. The ratings that, of course, when you went through my class, if you went through my class or any of these introductions, you're going to see that standard test condition ratings. We see what is the panel rating. If it's a 300 watt panel, that's how much power it's going to generate under standard test conditions. Well, there is the STC versus NOCT, and now we talk about the NMOT ratings. So I'll touch a little bit on that. I don't want to get too deep into those because hopefully, that's fairly familiar territory. Then there's also the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 rating system that we see on panels. That's primarily a financial health kind of rating system. We'll touch on that. Then we get into some of the standards that are applied in the manufacturing and testing of solar panels. So the UL ANSI 1703, that's been the traditional one, but there are a few more out there that we need to be aware of, and that's transitioning a little bit as well. And then there's the rating system that you may not have heard about, which is the Product Qualification Program, the PQP. And it's from an organization called PVEL, I think PVEL. We'll touch on that and see exactly what that's all about as well. So the first rating, and again, if people have questions as I'm talking through this, feel free to just jump in. You'll have to unmute yourself in order to do so. But STC, standard test conditions, those three conditions that are always met, it's 25 degrees Celsius, which is 77 degrees Fahrenheit. We're at about 1,000 watts per square meter of irradiance and air mass of 1.5. And, that's the one nobody cares about, but it's there, So anyway, that is not going to tell you anything, except that if I compare one panel with another panel, I'm talking apples to apples. So one panel that's 600 watts or whatever is going to be similar to another 600 watt panel. One 300 watt panel is comparable to another 300 watt panel under those conditions, but it's not going to tell you that it's going to generate 300 watts. It's just saying that comparing to one to the other when it's under standard test conditions that happen rarely, that's what it would be. So they came up with NOCT, which was really an attempt to try and get into more real world. What will it produce when it's out there in the real world? So the irradiance was not 1,000 watts per square meter, it's 800 watts per square meter. The panel temperature basically is 45 degrees Celsius, but they say an air temperature of 20 degrees Celsius, and then wind speeds of 1 meter per second. So that's an attempt to do real world a little bit closer to what the panel may actually produce. Problem there is every installation is unique. So even that is not really going to tell you much, but you'll see in every panel spec, it's going to have that number there as well, except that we began to see NOCT in 2016 began to be replaced with NMOT. And there's some subtle variations between those two, but really it's more for the manufacturers. It really is about how they're tested versus what they're testing for. So just for our purposes, at least in my mind, I just say, oh, NOCT, NMOT, those are same thing. They're pretty much comparable. So it's just new terminology, new testing that's being done. The argument, of course, that they try and make is that the NMOT is talking about yield, whereas the STC is just talking about a rating. As I just mentioned, every installation is unique. So the yield is going to vary based on angle, altitude, azimuth, shading, individual temperature. So it's hard to really get into what it's going to produce until you do a site analysis. Okay, then we get into the second one, and this confuses folks a bit. This is the tier system of rating. There's a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And basically, this was created by Bloomberg. It's a financial rating system. It's not a quality thing. But we hear that oftentimes people think tier 1 solar panels must be better than tier 2 solar panels. Well, that's not necessarily the case. It just means the panel manufacturer's been around a while. It's bigger. So any new startup in panels is probably going to be rated as tier 3. They may be the best panel on the market for all we know, but they're still only going to be rated as tier 3. So this is a financial health model, not a quality model for the solar panels. And then we get into standards. Now, we've been talking a long time about UL 1703, and that is the manufacturing guidelines that we're requiring. And we always say if it's not 1703, don't buy it. Well, there was the ISC 61730, and that was a little bit more rigorous and accepted in other countries like Europe and Europe's not a country, I know, but the countries of Europe and Australia and other places. And because this is a global marketplace, there was an attempt a few years back to begin to harmonize the UL 1703 with the 61730. And at this point now, we really are just talking about one standard. The UL 61730 is the replacement or the evolution of the UL 1703. So that is a manufacturing standard. There is also a 61730-2 that gets into some other testing conditions, environmental conditions. But once again, don't buy a panel that is not rated by these standards. And they exist. Then there's another standard out there, the 61215, and this talks about how they will operate over a longer term period. And so it's designed to really talk about performance in the field as opposed to the initial manufacturing standard. So those are standards that you're going to want to look for when you're purchasing a panel. Pretty straightforward. That has to do with safety and quality under the initial condition. But there are some problems with these standards, which I'll touch on here in just a second. They're only really focused on screening for the first couple of years of operation. So we're installing these panels for 25, 30 years. So is that testing process going to mean that that panel is going to last? The folks that manufacture these can also cherry pick the panels they want to be assessed. So they go out and they pick their very best panel, they submit it for review. Does that mean that the quality is over the entire run? These guys have multiple factories and multiple locations. It's on a Monday versus a Wednesday or whatever, and these panels may not be up to the performance level of the very individually cherry-picked one that they submitted to the standards testing body. And they're very slow to evolve. The processes are very, very slow for these standards bodies, and the technology within this field changes pretty rapidly. So they're always going to be lagging behind. Well, because there's this hole in the marketplace of people saying, well, I need to know what's a quality panel, then there was a company called PVEL that came out, and PVEL stands for, PV Evolution Labs. I'm having to look at my notes behind the camera. It's like, damn thing. All right, so, okay, so what are they doing? Well, they're trying to provide developers of large solar arrays with some indication of what is a good quality panel, what's not a good quality panel. They're also wanting to provide manufacturers, to show their wares. If you're out there, you're doing a lot of work trying to produce a good product, you want people to know about it. Well, every salesperson from every company is going to tell you their product is the best. Well, you need to have some sort of independent consumer reports kind of thing that's going to look at these and test for high quality, low quality. So now what's evolved is in some of the larger installations, they're really requiring that the panel be on the PQP, the panel qualification program, that it must be on that list before they're even going to use it. So it's become this sort of standard of quality. And there was an interesting podcast I just listened to this week from one of the guys from PVEL, and he was saying that what they've seen in the evolution of this process is that, somebody comes up with a new technology, And some people implement it well. Some companies don't. They find the quality, there's quite a disparity between one versus the other. They begin to promote, this one's a good one, this one's not so good, you know, that kind of thing. And then everybody kind of pulls themselves up, at least the major players, so that there's not much difference between the panels. And he was saying, well, if that was where it ended, you know, we'd be out of business, his company, this evaluation. Problem is the technology then changes again, and everybody goes through these same steps again. So the need for this independent testing is clearly out there, and people are taking advantage. So what are some of the tests that they're putting out there? Well, these are, you know, how is the glass? Is the glass going to break? How about the junction box? How are those things being, are they, you know, sealed properly, are soldered properly, that kind of thing? They look for potential induced degradation, PID, that has been a big issue there. The diodes, whether they fail or not, the bus bar corrosion within there, and some of the delamination as you have the different layers in the panel. How do they hold up under the environment over the long term, over a 20-year period? You know, how are these things gonna hold up? So then, just to give you a sense of who the folks are that are doing well, some of these names are going to be pretty familiar to you. Jinko, Trina Solar, JA Solar, Q Cells, REC, Astro Energy, Longi. So it's kind of interesting when they do put these things out, they show which ones have reached top marks, you know, over the years. So a company like Jinko up there at the top, it shows that it's been rated by PQP since 2014. But once again, in that webinar I was listening to, because of the Inflation Reduction Act, we're starting to see more players come into the marketplace. So just because a company has only been rated there for 1 year doesn't necessarily mean they're any worse or any better than a company like Jinko that's been going through the rating process for multiple years. It may mean that they're just a new competitor. And I see a note here in the chat saying, are any of these domestic products? That depends. That depends on how you want to define domestic. I think at the moment, my short answer would be no, you know, because to my way of thinking anyway, the only two truly domestic manufacturers, at least at the moment, of solar panels are First Solar and Toledo Solar out of Toledo, Ohio, giving a heads up to Ohio here. But they're the thin film manufacturers, because still 95% of the solar cells are coming out of China. So some of these may be assembled in the US, but does that make them a US solar panel? And we're still waiting for guidance from the IRS to say what constitutes a domestically manufactured solar panel when it comes to that extra 10% tax credit that's going to be out there. Now, a lot of these companies are setting up manufacturing plants here in the United States because of the IRA, but it's probably going to be a year or two for sure before they actually have any products streaming out of those. You know, takes a while to build these things. So I haven't heard of any of this last wave since the IRA was passed that are actually producing yet. Anybody have any information that I don't have on that? So at this point, I'm going to throw it open to comments because I'm done as far as what I've got. So anybody have any comments here? I'm going to throw it to gallery in case people are waving at me.
Jay, I do have a follow-up question about the domestically produced. You said First Solar is the only other.
And Toledo Solar.
And so, but is First Solar the only one that's doing something other than thin film?
No, Toledo Solar is thin film as well.
Right. Oh, so they're both thin film.
Yes. Now, First Solar only sells to utility scale system.
Okay.
Sorry, did I say Toledo? Toledo Solar is getting into the marketplace for residential and commercial.
Okay. Yeah.
And we did a thing on this last week, but
Yeah.
yeah. So once again, the thin film is still a good quality product. These particular ones they claim are actually better than silicon, but it's going to require its own, unique racking system, or clamping system at least, because they're much thinner. But it's a different type of panel. I don't know of any silicon-based panels that would really be truly US based.
Okay, that was my next question. Thanks.
Yeah. But that'll change next year, because again, everybody's moving into that market for that very reason. Although who knows, we may see that we get an evolution to thin film, because my understanding is the process, to build a thin film producing plant is a lot less energy intensive, time intensive, machinery intensive than a silicon producing plant. And I did see a German company, I can't remember the name of it, but when I was doing research for the news, they're moving to a glass on glass process like thin film, but I could not tell from the article whether it was silicon still or whether it was a thin film. But I believe, unless patents are going to get into the way that we're going to start seeing more and more thin film competition out there. Any other comments there? I see Tony up there. Hey, Tony, you got anything from the world of batteries and battery charging or EV charging?
I spent the last week in the swamp. So I was in DC, all over Capitol Hill, talking to a bunch of legislators and their staff about a bunch of stuff, right? But the future of energy, the importance of, onshoring a lot of this. So that was an eye-opening experience. Unfortunately, I think that energy is still a rather over-politicized issue, right? I kind of saw that firsthand. It's not, I don't think it's as bad as maybe I suspected, but it's still, unfortunately, a kind of an overly politicized issue. I think on the tails of the IRA, everyone's slowly starting to come to grips that this is a massive opportunity for jobs in manufacturing and national and local energy security. So the more that narrative gets pushed, I think the kind of the easier this transition and faster this transition will be.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting that you say the political thing, because I guess because I'm in the bubble of all of this, I think that, a lot of that's gone by the wayside. But I've been out doing a few commercial assessments for the REAP grant, which is usually we're dealing with agricultural businesses and small community businesses. And as I'm doing it, I'm saying, now, are you anticipating you're going to need car charging stations in the future and electric vehicles? And about half the time I get this kind of knee jerk, I don't want none of them electric vehicle type things. And I said, but you're going to own one, I mean, because you're not going to have a choice. And I don't care if you just don't like the idea of it. And it's like, it's that kind of, it just always surprises me a little bit, because I think they're like super great. It's almost like someone saying, I don't want to get rid of my typewriter. I don't like those computers, and you're like, yeah, but you're going to have to.
Jay, how old are these people? They might make it out another way.
Yeah, I don't know. Some of them, well, they're all younger than me anymore. I don't quite get how that happened, but I always used to be the youngest guy. Now I seem not to be anymore.
Yeah, if they're getting up there in age and they say they'll never buy an electric vehicle, they might win by technicality, right?
Yeah,
Exactly.
That's right. Yep, but when I'm beginning to see, and I think we're going to see a subtle change in mindset here as well, is more and more of the car company commercials are really pushing the advantages of EVs. You know, I'm starting to see it's almost becoming very commonplace that,
Sure.
you know, you're not buying it because of this, you're buying it because I drove it through Antarctica and I drove it 0 to 60 in 1.2 seconds and all of that kind of thing. So that's interesting that I think people's perception of these are just eco vehicles, you know, are going to change to these are now high performance vehicles.
Yes. Yeah. And I think Tesla did a better, I mean, that was really how they revolutionized this whole transportation industry, is because whether it's speed or kind of the sexiness or safety, those are the reasons that you're going to buy an electric vehicle. And environmentally friendly is not even on that, not even on those top three. And I think that kind of gets away from the start and stop that we saw here in the country a little bit, but what I think we saw globally a lot more, which is like single person, 3-wheeled electric vehicles. Like that doesn't resonate in the United States, right? Like, cool, I got it, you know, pretty light, very, very efficient, great carbon footprint, but that's not a compelling transportation solution in the United States and most other places, right? So reframing this for performance and speed and, you know, all of the other things is, I think, the hands down the right way to do it. And like you said, Jay, I mean, every major auto company in the world has said that they will go, you know, mostly or entirely electric by, like, you know, 2035, 2040, right?
Right.
So they need to adjust their marketing material and their support, because if they don't, they'll go bankrupt. It's a very straightforward path here. So it'll be interesting to watch.
Yeah, another market segment that's just sort of gotten into my peripheral vision a little bit is the electric bicycle world. And I was just up doing some evaluations in Amish country, and my gosh, the Amish are just all over electric bikes.
Really?
Yeah, they're zooming around up there on their little electric bicycles. And then we had an intern who came and visited this week, and he lives in Oakland in San Francisco area, and he's got a handyman repair business. And he's converted these electric bikes to where he can carry chop saws and ladders and everything around in these. They're like little cargo vehicles. They can even pull a trailer. And in San Francisco, of course, there's no parking. There's no, roads are narrow and difficult. So his whole handyman world is, he's got guys now going around on electric bikes doing all of their service calls, you know, because they could spend hours trying to find a place to park, but now they just pull up on the sidewalk and, you know, park their bikes. So that may be another charging station world that, as more and more people have these electric bicycles, that's another little need, sort of like phone charging, halfway between car charging and phone charging.
Right. Yeah. It's from, like, if you want to do it from like a distributed energy generation perspective, right? It's also, the footprint of that is a lot smaller. So the solar required and energy storage required to kind of 100% charge e-bikes from the sun is much less dramatic than a full scale electric vehicle.
Yep.
Those have been popular in Europe for a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so speaking of technicalities, it sounds like an e-bike in Amish country sounds like, how are they? What's the charging situation looking like there?
A lot of solar in Amish country.
I was going to say, here in Kentucky too, the Amish guys I know all have solar, and they run their one telephone, fax machine, because they still don't have computers, and a couple lights, but that's all they have. You're right.
Yeah, the concept there is not anti-electricity. The concept is anti-connectivity to any system outside of their own independent system. So they've used diesel generators for a while. Now they're moving into standalone solar systems, e-bikes, things like that. So it feels to me a little like you've lost the plot a little bit. But I'm not the one to judge on that. Yeah, let me hit a couple of the chat things. I just noticed here somebody asking, were there no coal or gas plants built. Well, yeah, gas 10% over the last year or so, but no coal, no nuclear. Those are two industries that are pretty much dead. Let's see. Oh, the domestic product. Yeah.
I was gonna say, I don't have a dog in the fight, but just for the nuclear, did you notice that they do have a number of these small generation plants that have been approved? They're not built yet, but they're the ones like a train car or something.
Yeah. Yeah. I see those things periodically, and I've been seeing them periodically for the last 15 years. I think that's people chasing government money. My guess is they'll never be built. There'll be a lot of work done on them until the grant funding runs out, and then they'll come up with this. It's sort of every so often somebody gets this new idea, and then government wants to throw money at them. But why would you do it? I mean, compared the cost, compared the ecological issues compared to solar, it just doesn't make any sense, except that you're chasing money. So
Yeah, it'll be a not in my backyard issue, I'm sure.
oh, for sure. And periodically it always reminds me a little bit of, I don't know, this is a weird story, but my uncle lived up in the mountains of Colorado, and they built a golf course up there, and the elk kept coming in and eating the greens, because you're putting a golf course up in elk territory. So they decided the best way to ward them off was they had these like little shotgun shell things that went off periodically during the night to scare them away. And they came back the next morning after installing this system, and it looked like someone had rototilled up all of the greens on the golf course, because what happened was the thing would go off and the elk would scatter and their feet would tear up the greens. And just when they thought everything was fine, they'd sort of settle back in and start eating again. And then the next shell would go off, and they did it again and again. That's kind of how nuclear is. It's like we get into this kind of sense of, well, you know what, maybe it's not such a terrible thing. And then we have Fukushima or 3 Mile Island or Chernobyl. It's like every 20 some years, there's some big thing. And then everybody's like, no, I'm not touching that with a 10-foot pole. So, it's that thing of, it's a good technology unless something goes wrong, and something always goes wrong. In anything man makes, something's going to go wrong.
And then there's terrorism.
Yeah, well, of course we've got that, and you can, I mean, they can take down a plane with a box cutter. So what can you do with a nuclear power plant? Not so good. And we don't even need terrorism for nuclear power plants to go south on us. So.
Right, it's like one of the few things that nuclear power plants have going for it is that it can generate, pretty extreme high energy density in like a X given, square mile footprint. And so you're going to take one of the only redeeming factors of the entire thing, and then you're just going to shatter it and distribute it, so that you have to fight the same food fights that you have to fight with one centralized big location in 100 different places with 100 different communities suing the hell out of you 100 different times, and having to worry about, how are things getting from point A to point B? How is the waste getting disposed of on site, which is how it typically is. But instead of having those, one-offs a couple times all over the country, you're just doing this hundreds of times. It doesn't make any sense, right? At all, like zero sense.
Well, the only time that seems to be the logic behind these, I think, is they're saying we're going to take the waste that's generated from existing power plants and turn that into the fuel that fuels these smaller power plants. And if that's something that could happen, but my guess is things with the nuclear industry never seem to run as smoothly as they like to project it in the beginning. So, nuclear waste disposal is a big issue. That's, if this is a solution for that, not an energy generating thing, but a way to dispose of nuclear waste, maybe there's a role for it to play. But as a competition, just straight up for generation of power, I just don't see it. So,
I mean, also what it has to do is like look at the Vogtle plant in Georgia, right? It's like, this is why it's not viable. And I think when people look at it for nuclear just in general, there's like three stools. One of them is the engineer, like this is physics based, it's super energy dense, this is awesome. And that's true. But like they're not looking at like the economics part of this stool or like the social part of this stool.
Mhm.
And so it's extremely expensive to generate a kilowatt hour. Cost overruns, all of the crazy legislation. You can't even get it out of the ground. You're sued multiple times by multiple different groups at multiple different levels because nobody wants it in their backyard. And it's like, all right, let's maybe do other things.
Yeah, there are better alternatives. So, yep. So that's good. We've put the whole nuclear thing to rest. So no more problems there with nuclear.
Pretty good for a Tuesday morning.
I know. So do you want to deal with Middle East peace?
And somewhere in California, there's a group they're having their weekly discussion on fusion. So
Yeah. Yeah, it's for sure. And I hear the discussion periodically, and I just think it's a lot like fuel cells in my mind. You know, fuel cells is one of those that comes up periodically, and it's always this technology of the future. And I mean, if you look back through the literature in the 1970s, they were still talking about fuel cells are going to be big in 15 years. And then today you get fuel cells are going to be big in 15 years. You know, it's always 15 years off in the future, and there's always a better alternative. So, you know, it's that old thing of, well, something's going on over here, there's something else going on over there. And battery technology seems to always sort of outgun fuel cells because it doesn't have the inherent problems that hydrogen has as a source of fuel.
Yeah, I think all of us on this call are very big, fusion fans. The sun, right? Like,
Yeah, I know. We have
we already have our fusion reactor, guys. Let's get to work. Let's
Yeah.
go.
Yep. Okay. Anybody else have anything else they want to bring up for the good of the cause?
I've got a practical question, Jay.
Sure.
But I know the answers in my own head because my uncle brought this to me. I was checking to see if anybody had ever dealt with Blue Raven Solar. It's one of these things that you've talked about before. You should be sold it, or you should buy it, not be sold it.
Yeah.
You know, the first thing I did was I calculated it was they were charging you $6 a watt hour or $6 a watt.
Yeah.
So I stopped there, but I was just checking to see if I told him I would ask people on the call if anybody had ever heard of it or dealt with them.
I don't know. I haven't heard of them specifically.
Well, they have a 2-star review on Yelp, so
Do they?
leading
Okay.
the charge there. Real.
I didn't even get that far. I just got the numbers showing, but I got the wattage and the watts and the dollar price before financing. And at that point, I told him no, but he said that he asked me to check.
Yeah. Is
Okay.
is this one of those rent own or
Well,
is
this
it
one
a
was-
buy?
It was a buy, and they said they would give you the credits. Now he's retired, so I don't even know if he could use the credits, to be quite frank.
Yeah.
But this is a buy situation, and I did not see any paperwork. I asked him for an agreement before he ever talked to anybody, just to make sure. He's not going to do it, but they have on their website where I just kind of perused it for a little bit. Guaranteed something to the effect of guaranteed production credits or whatever. You're not going to ever pay your utility bill again. You'll just pay them.
Yeah.
So I didn't go, like I said, I didn't go into it, didn't see anything in real writing other than what was on the headlines, but I thought I would ask just to make sure if I could tell him somebody has already dealt with them, that they're no good. It'll make my conversation easier.
Well, tell your uncle you'll install it for him for $2 a kilowatt.
Well, that's what I'm afraid of.
watt.
That's the problem. I'm afraid he's going to have me up on the roof doing it.
Yeah. Well, you got the know-how. So.
They know how. I told him if he get his kids up there, I'd tell him how to do it.
Okay.
So,
I
okay,
guess
thanks.
no one's going to help you out there, Don. So.
That's fine. Well,
Well, Blue Raven actually came up last week in this discussion, and one of the things that I was asking about is whether or not it's normal for a company to have the consumer assign their SREC profits.
oh, is
to
that the
the
one you were talking
company?
about? Okay.
Yes, it was Blue Raven.
Okay, because that's not on their website. On the website, they say you keep your tax credits. I didn't the SREX part was not listed on there. So that,
Yeah, you keep your tax credits and they keep your SREC profits.
okay, fair enough.
Yeah. And the other thing that I was asking about is why they would install everything horizontally, there really is no good answer.
Well, if it helps you any, the number of panels they said they were going to put on his roof, I don't understand how they'll get on there, first of all, but his roof is east-west primarily. He's got a little piece of south. And, I asked him about that. They said, well, yeah, but we're going to put whatever we can on the south. We'll just put the rest of on the east-west. Won't make much difference.
It'll make a 20% difference for sure.
I understand. That's what I tried to, yes, I understand, yes.
I also don't think they have really a firm price table, because the client that came to me with their Blue Raven quote was actually quoted $4.71 a watt.
Okay.
So that seems pretty drastically different from what you saw. So I'm guessing they really don't have a price table. It's just, fluctuates based upon what the salesmen think they can get.
Yeah, I'm assuming it's whatever they think they can get. It's like one time I had somebody offer to paint my house for, I think it was $18,000. I called somebody locally and they said they do it for $6,000. Then those guys came back and said, well, we'll do it for $6,000 too if you want.
I just saw an evaluation I thought was weird, where the estimate didn't even say what size array it was. It said 18 panels. And I kept going, well, what size is that? I don't know. Are these 300 watt panels? Are they 400 watt panels? I mean, it kind of makes a difference. So, yeah.
Exactly.
All right. Okay. Any other comments before we call it a day? All right. Well, thanks for your attention, and we'll see you next week then. All right. Take care.
See you, Jay.
Bye-bye.